Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for SNF Agora Conversations. I'm Henry Farrell. I'm the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute Professor of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And the SNF Agora Institute, I should say, is an academic center and a public forum, which is dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. Between now and the upcoming US presidential election, we will be having a series of conversations that will consider specific threats to American democracy, while also looking for moments of democratic resilience and possible paths forward. And today I am delighted to be joined by two excellent guests, Karen Brinson-Bell, who is the Executive Director of the North Carolina Board of Elections, and Bruce Schneier, who is an internationally renowned security technologist and a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And the two of them have different but complementary understandings to bring to the table today. Karen has a deep and detailed grasp of how these processes work in practice, while Bruce has a rich experience in how to think about the relationship between security and information across a broad variety of settings. And what I hope to do as the moderator is to facilitate a conversation between these different approaches along the lines of the much broader conversation that we all need to start in the US and elsewhere about these problems and questions. So thank you both very much for being here. So how this is going to work, the three of us will spend about 30 minutes discussing various vulnerabilities of our election system and what is being done to mitigate these threats. And then after that, we will open it up to questions. And anytime during this conversation, if you have a question, you can submit the question through the dialog box, which is right next to the video, or just below it, depending on which specific device you are using in order to join us today. So let me begin by asking Karen a question, which Bruce can also come in on as well, which is, Karen, from your experience, what are the major security problems confronting the US election system right now?
Really, the one that's so prevalent is misinformation and disinformation. I think we get caught up in some of the more high-profile things when we talk about voting equipment and voting systems and things of that nature. But when you really get down to it, it's more a matter of misinformation and disinformation and how we can educate the public to understand all the protocols and procedures that are in place to secure our election system and to ensure the integrity of the elections.
And Bruce, I know that this is something that you have thought about a lot as well. So what do you think?
So I want to add some other risks. Certainly we have risks in voter suppression. The goal of an election should be that anybody who is eligible to vote and wants to vote is able to vote and able to have their vote counted. And there are many barriers to that in different states, ranging from ID requirements, registration requirements, misinformation, long lines, not enough machines, bad machines. And so I thought you could all lump that into the threats that someone's vote just isn't counted for some reason. And
yeah, go ahead.
So, and I think that's important to look at. I say we can look at the voting process. How do we choose? And their misinformation and the debate and gerrymandering, all of that matters. Then there's sort of the actual, I'm ready to vote. I know who I want to vote for. And what are the barriers for me doing that? Both of those are under attack right now in ways we're not going to really understand until after it's over.
So Karen, I know that your responsibility as an official is to administrate the rules that effectively have been set by the legislature or by other actors. But when you are implementing these rules, how do you think about these potential problems?
Well, as an election administrator, I mean, our profession is grounded in administering the laws that are on the books. So a lot of times folks think that, we influence that policy. And in some ways we do because we have to carry it out. But the actual policy or the actual law is written at the state legislature. And so, when and each state has their own set of election laws. There are some federal guidelines and laws in place, but overall, how an election functions, how we carry out and administer that election is set by each state. And so in my role as the chief elections official for North Carolina, I give guidance to our 100 county boards of elections, interpretations of the law, how to carry out the law as it's written. Obviously, we also wind up in litigation at times where I have to explain how we're carrying that out or how we would adapt to whatever the ruling might be. And really, I think what's, it goes back to what Bruce was saying. What we have to do is be able to tell our story, make this as transparent as possible, and there is a fine line between transparency and security, so we have to walk that fine line. But in the end, the objective at the end of the day is to administer the law as it's written, but to do so in a way that every voter gets to exercise their right to vote. And this year, it just happens to be that we add on without fear of disease.
So a quite extraordinary set of problems. So Bruce, one of the things that Karen raised there was, of course, the problem of disinformation. So what do you think about what is happening, perhaps to try and tackle this problem right now? Do you think that there are efforts being made to tackle this? Or do you think that we are in a little bit of a free-for-all?
I think both are true. I mean, there's sort of a fundamental problem where the actual institutions of democracy and liberty are being used against us. We want a world where people are free to say whatever they want. We want freedom of the press, freedom of speech. And that brings with it both true speech and false speech. And you can't get one without the other. We don't want Facebook to monitor truth. We don't want the government to monitor truth. At the same time, we don't want organized disinformation, misinformation campaigns by foreign actors. We actually kind of don't want them by our elected officials either. But this is not something that is an election problem. It's very much a societal problem. It affects, it's going to affect health, it's going to affect COVID and vaccines, it's affecting masking, it's affecting politics at all levels, it's affecting how we view society. So while this is an issue, I don't see it as a specific election issue. There's really nothing we can do in the election context. I think that'll really help.
So Karen, given your responsibilities, you've already spoken a little bit about openness and transparency. What role do those have to play in a practical sense in trying to push back against potential disinformation? What kinds of practical things do you and other election officials around the country try to do in order to make sure that voters have the right information?
Really, it's a challenge because there are so many means of communication, so many media outlets, so many social media sources that we have to figure out how to break through the noise. And as government agencies and election officials, we aren't necessarily going to put out the flashiest or most flamboyant comments on social media or say those things that are the right soundbite for the nightly news or something like that. But so we have to do what we can, and the way we can approach that is what our state did is to launch a voter confidence campaign where we have tried to pull back the curtain and show people how we operate. We updated our website, we totally reformatted it, and have tried to put out more data and more analytics so that people can know what's happening in a timely fashion and be able to crunch those numbers for themselves. As a state, not just as a state, but as organizations like the National Association of State Election Directors, the National Association of Secretaries of State, and through our partners at DHS and CISA, there's been a coordinated effort to put out a campaign on trusted info. So I think there's just really an emphasis by across the country, but at our state level too, to make sure that people are informed. One of the things that we did with our voter confidence campaign was just to put out a simple list of 10 facts about elections in North Carolina, and especially from a security perspective. And it starts with point number one is that we've not had a successful attack on North Carolina elections, and and then the other steps take you through what is it that we do that has helped ensure that that hasn't been successful, and both proactively and reactively in some sense. And then point number 10 is actually the importance of the voter. Them being engaged, them questioning, is this a good source of information? If it makes them pause, they probably need to research it and get more information from a trusted source. But then also being involved in the process. The best way to know how elections work is to be a part of it. And it's not just in voting, but to be an election official. We will have 25,000 to 30,000 people who will man our voting sites as election officials and actually carry out democracy just for this election alone. And that's the best way that they can understand what's taking place.
So Bruce, sorry, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, things I think Karen's doing in North Carolina are vital. I mean, I'll think of elections like this. They have two purposes. We always talk about they select the winner, but equally important is they have to convince the loser. And if they don't do that, they fail. So all of these measures to increase confidence, increase transparency in the process means that after the election's over, both sides can look at it and say, yep, that was fair, that was accurate, that was the answer. I might not like it, but it was the true answer. And that's really important, especially this year.
So Karen, could you tell us, you've spoken a lot about how it is that you and your fellow officials are trying to do this before the election. Have you devoted much thought to what might happen in a situation where people disagree with the election process afterwards? What kinds of information provision, what kinds of transparency you can provide them in order to assure people that in fact the election was carried out as it ought to have been?
So I think it's the things we do before an election and then the things that we do after election, and making sure that everyone understands what all those steps are. Making that information available, making the processes where there's public observation. So for example, before every election, we do what's called logic and accuracy testing. There's so many questions quite often about how our voting systems work, but we allow for public viewing of our logic and accuracy testing. I will not say that will be the most riveting experience of someone's life, because we stand there in front of every piece of voting equipment, every component, and we test every unit, every component, every ballot style, every ballot position with a unique test script to make sure that the scanners are reading those ballots correctly, that the ballots have been coded correctly. We feed that into computers to make sure that the tabulation software is working correctly. We do a mock election to make sure that even our aggregation up to the state level is working correctly. Then we volume test. And there's even, this year it won't happen, but in some of our smaller elections, we will actually test more ballots than we'll get or cast during an election. But that's on the front end. On the back end, we want people to see our audit processes. We have 5 different audit processes that we do after an election. Some very simplistic of taking voter history and making sure that that matches the number of people that checked in matches to the number of ballots cast into those voting machines. So, just that ratio, that point of checks and balances is so important. But then we also, North Carolina was one of the first states to do a post-election audit, and we do a random sampling. The counties do not know what they're going to receive in terms of the precincts that they may have to count, or those early voting sites that may have to do a hand-to-eye count to ensure that the votes were, that that tabulation system was working correctly. So those are just some of the things that we do, and all of those processes can be seen in person by people who want to observe, even during the coronavirus, as we've been doing these types of sessions, over teleconference systems. So, and then it's just the fact that they are the people working in those polling places. They are the people that make up our bipartisan boards, and that's across the country. I mean, there's some sort of setup where it is a bipartisan or nonpartisan operation, so that people can have that confidence too.
So I really like the way that you emphasize here how a lot of this is, so first of all, this is process. And this is process which almost by design is non-riveting. This is not supposed to be something where there's supposed to be exciting surprises. This is supposed to be something where you see a straightforward process and the process working in order to make people confident that in fact what has happened is what should have happened. So also when I'm hearing this, I'm thinking about, and this is a set of debates that Bruce is familiar with, people like Matt Blaze, the arguments about sort of post-election auditing, all of these kinds of things. Would you be able to talk a little bit, Bruce, about the broader debates about these kinds of processes and what kinds of processes work from the point of view of providing both assurance after the vote has taken place that the right thing happened, and also, and this is a subtly different problem, ensuring that the public is confident in this assurance process that everything has worked out right?
So there are two things we need to make this work. The first is a voter verifiable paper ballot. I vote in Minnesota, and I get a piece of paper. I fill in ovals. It is a paper ballot. I feed it into an optical scan reader. There is an immediate tabulation. The system will tell me if I overvoted or undervoted. And then that paper drops into a ballot box, and that's available for recounts and audits.
And random auditing is key afterwards, obviously. This is a much more in the weeds kind of question, but one of the things that I was surprised by when I first came to the United States, you may have guessed from my accent that I'm originally Irish, is the way in which the election process in the US is so decentralized, in which you have so many different rules for different localities, different states, and a relatively limited role for the federal government in all of these questions or in overseeing it. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what are the advantages and what are the potential weaknesses of this from the point of view of ensuring election security? What kinds of ways, you mentioned discussions with the Department of Homeland Security, what kinds of discussions you and other election officials have, and what kinds of ways this might progress in the future?
As a whole, the decentralization is seen as actually a strength in our security because there's no one singular point of attack. We don't have the same voting system across the country. We don't even have the same voting system throughout all of North Carolina. And so that means that, by having these smaller components, it's really difficult for an attacker to penetrate the system. Now, what I think is imperative and where the strength does come into play is making sure that we have as much uniformity in our processes. So when I was talking about those audit procedures or the logic and accuracy testing, we have uniform expectations and guidelines that are set forward so that we are adhering to those same standards. And that's what that's how we rely on each other within our state or from state to state, is knowing that those practices are in place. It's things like having an election assistance commission that gives guidelines regarding voting systems, for example. That was put into place after some of the confusion that happened in 2000 with the Bush-Gore race and the now infamous hanging chads. So, voting systems I talk about a lot because it's something that's very concrete and people can visualize. It does become a little more difficult when we start talking about voter registration databases and things of that nature. But of course, we do have the National Voter Registration Act that helps us in terms of how we even do something like list maintenance to ensure that that's uniformly handled across the country. So, there are strengths and weaknesses to having a decentralized system, but for the most part, it's seen as, it's hard to communicate sometimes, but that decentralization does give us actually some strength in our, how vulnerable or less vulnerable we are to attack. It's hard to take out the whole system at one time.
Well, let me give you a practical question here, which is that, of course, back in 2016, one of the things that we seem to have gotten from FBI and other reports from the intelligence community is that there was some probing, for example, of voter registration databases by actors who seem to have been linked to Russian intelligence. So if you are say, for example, you're a local official in some small electoral district, and you suddenly discover that this possibly has been happening, or you hear from somebody that it has happened somewhere else. what kinds of resources do you have to go to if you're somebody who hasn't necessarily been trained in cybersecurity or the security of online systems? What kinds of resources do you have to go to in order to try and figure out a problem like that?
It's a really good question. And it kind of gets to the point that I was meaning, that the communication sometimes becomes difficult. It also is a lot more monitoring because you don't have a single system to be monitoring. But our federal partners and our state partners, they are assisting us. We have even expanded our cybersecurity presence on our own state board staff so that we can monitor what's going on in the 100 counties. What they're looking for, they can now alert us to threats or possible areas of concern. It has required a concerted effort to make sure that everyone's up to speed. We're election administrators. We're now having to wear a cybersecurity hat, but we're having to become familiar with what is phishing, what is ransomware, how could our systems be penetrated. And so that collective voice coming from our federal authorities, coming from our state authorities that work directly with them, such as our cybersecurity unit at the North Carolina National Guard, are helping to not only train us, they help to monitor, and then they intervene when necessary to get us, operational if there is something that, potentially jeopardizes or is a threat. So, it is a coordinated effort. Since 2016, we have seen a tremendous infusion of that effort, and we do routine briefings. We have even, something as simple as what was implemented recently of a single email that allows us to alert those social media outlets has now been coordinated through CISA so that we can, we don't have to ping each one of them. And so from the most lower level to the state level and nationwide, we now have an escalation process that probably, honestly was not in place prior to 2016 to the extent that it is now. Is there room for improvement? There always is, and we assess that constantly. But I can say that in my year and a half of being the state elections director for North Carolina and having been out in the county and other roles, even just over the past year and a half, great strides have been made. And it's sometimes the things that we can't talk about, that fine line again between transparency and security, but the coordinated effort has substantially increased over the past year and a half.
So Bruce, this kind of thing, thinking about information systems from a security perspective, this is something that has been the cornerstone of your career. So what kinds of advice would you offer to election officials in order to try and get into the appropriate mindset to think about the threats that they might face and to mitigate these threats as best as they can, given the resources and given the constraints that they face?
I actually worry a lot about the distributed nature of the U.S. elections. I mean, yeah, they were great strengths in the mid-1800s, but I think they are liabilities today. Because, knowing what a phishing attack is, knowing what denial of service might be, no matter how well trained North Carolina is, some election officials versus the government of Russia is just not a fair fight. And I am looking at other countries, Canada, Australia, the UK, Japan, that have a national infrastructure for secure, accurate, fair elections is really better suited to the internet level threats. We used to have the idea that we would put a person from party A and party B in the same room, they would watch each other. And yeah, that again worked well when the threats were at that level. But we're dealing with adversaries that are very powerful and very capable. So I worry about that. And the distributed nature has some benefit in that you really don't know where to target. But you kind of do. We know the 6 states. If I was the government of Russia, I would know where to target my attacks. And there not being a national defense hurts us. Now, a lot of reasons why we're here, we can't just change it really because of the Constitution. I think that is a big issue. And going forward, that's going to be worse. And again, here is our institutions being used against us. And that's going to be the discussion thinking about this long term. How can we best maintain what is valuable about our society while at the same time defending ourselves from these new, different threats that just aren't as easy to pinpoint as ballot stuffing. We've had examples of machines having results that just aren't accurate. We've had examples of voting rolls not working, and we don't have a system. And again, I'm not even sure how to make the system of what to do if there's a problem. What happens if at the end of the day on Tuesday, one state couldn't get their votes to work, just couldn't get it to work for whatever reason, or machines are opened and the tally is 0-0 and there's no paper ballot, or lots of people couldn't vote for whatever reason. There is no system in the U.S. to fix that. And once that happens, nobody's going to be advocating fairness. Everyone's going to be advocating their side wins. So suddenly this is partisan in a way a ransomware attack against a company isn't. And that again makes this very difficult. The challenges are real here. The wrong time to talk about them really is now. We've got to talk to them 2 years, 4 years before, but we need to commit to fair and accurate elections as society as a whole, even before we can talk about solutions.
So Karen, how would you respond? And if we're to begin a more detailed conversation about this, perhaps in mid-November of this year going forward, what kinds of things would you want to bring to the board to try and figure out these problems? Would you agree, disagree? What kinds of resources could we bring to bear on this question, given the situation that we're in and given the way that the US election system works?
I think it's the response time that I think hurts us at different points. The fact that we're still not with a second set of voluntary voting system guidelines, which so many states use to ensure, technology of our voting equipment. They're outdated, and technology changes more rapidly than we're able to in elections because of that. It's recognizing, that we need e-poll book standards that could be applied across the country, because we've got that for voting systems, but we don't have that as a nation for our poll books. And so even though we have made strides, I think, as individual states to move towards some sort of paper ballot or paper record, so that we can ensure that if the voting equipment goes down, there's still a way that we could have a manual count. We've put in procedures that if an e-poll book's not working, how do you go to a manual process and continue the election? Even though it might be a longer wait, we would still be able to continue. I do agree that if those are consistently just done state by state, then you don't have, some sort of national guidelines or minimal standards, then it is difficult. I think it just speaks to the testament that we work as an association, thank goodness, to ensure that we're as compliant as possible. But how we get there is really, it's difficult, because voting and elections have become a partisan topic within the legislatures. And so the laws that sometimes need to get rewritten at the state level become a ping pong match instead of moving forward and actually moving us in the direction that we need, just sometimes from a practical standpoint, and has nothing to do with a partisan agenda.
So if I'm to understand you both, one, and this may be far from a perfect solution to the problem, but one way forward might be national standards. We've heard national standards on poll books, national standards on perhaps use of paper ballots, and presumably also national standards perhaps on auditing, sort of post hoc random auditing to make sure that everything works as it should. Are there other areas where standards of this sort might work? Bruce, it looks like you want to jump in here.
Yeah, I break it into 5 different pieces. There's the poll books, who is eligible to vote, and making sure that only eligible voters vote. There's the vote itself, the machines tabulating the vote. Then there is the counting, that sort of pyramid scheme where results from each machine get aggregated into polling place and then maybe county or district, up to the state. And then there's the reporting mechanism by which the results are reported to the world. Those 4 areas need to be secured and have all been attacked. And then the 5th, of course, is auditing. The phrase is rate limit audit, and I don't know what North Carolina does, and I'm not sure what different states do. There's a certain kind of audit that's automatically triggered, and the extent of it is based on the margin of victory. But if it's a huge margin of victory, you only have to audit a few ballots. If it's very tiny, you audit a lot. But getting those in place beforehand, and getting all of this in place beforehand, when it's largely theoretical, is a lot better than figuring out after we already have a provisional result. So that's where I want to look. I do want national standards as much as possible. I mean, that increases buying power, that increases the ability to bring the cybersecurity expertise of the NSA and US Cyber Command onto these problems in a way that individual states just can't. And given that the threats are global, we need that. So these are the kind of discussions I want to have. I'd like to see an organization like the Census Bureau that's in charge of an accurate count of people, being in charge of an accurate count of the vote. That feels like something we as a nation could use. And I had one more point and I just lost it. So I think I'll end there.
Cara, do you want to jump in and respond to any of this?
I think I'm somewhere close to Bruce. I wouldn't say that we would move to a nationalization of our elections, but I do think that, the voluntary voting system guidelines and the EAC are a great example of how setting standards can be effective across the country. The National Voter Registration Act and how we implemented motor voter and, a national standard for even our list maintenance on our voter lists is an example of how there can be things put in place to where we can have sort of a baseline of how everyone's operating. I will also say, the audit arena is certainly something where we need to be considering. North Carolina's is not a risk limiting audit. We actually were scheduled to pilot that during the primary, and coronavirus sort of stopped us. You got to be in a room together, you got to handle those ballots, and that was not a good place to be in March. But we do have what's considered, we're beyond a conventional audit, and so we've always kind of set a unique standard in North Carolina by being what's still considered somewhat statistically significant. We'd like to move to the risk limiting audit, and we've gone so far as to talk to Dr. Ron Rivest at MIT about Bayesian audits and how that could be applied in elections. But all of that has to happen with some modernization within our voting equipment and within our procedures even. And not all states are there. So that's where that sort of standard, some minimal standards, a baseline could be helpful to get us all confident in that process across the country.
I think any state that talks to Dr. Rivest is doing well. I want to throw one idea out. This is one that I think we need to think about as a country, is the notion of a secret ballot. We have secret ballots for good reasons. That's not universal on this planet. There are still cantons in Switzerland that vote openly in a public square. You can see who votes. And if you eliminate the secret ballot, this is actually a lot easier. We can secure voting to a much greater degree, much, much easier. And some states have moved away from the absolute secrecy of the ballot box, right? Oregon doing all mail-in elections. I could theoretically hand someone $10 and get their ballot and fill it out for them. Now, that turns out not to be something that happens, right? Anyone who tries to do that at scale is going to get caught. That is not going to be the way to influence voting. And so it's not really a risk. But if we could think about the notion of ballot secrecy and whether it makes sense in an era where we all wear our partisanness on our sleeve, that will change security. And that's a big discussion. That's not a election security issue. That is a how we want democracy to work in our society question. But it is something we want to think about as we move forward into the information age.
I think there's a very interesting discussion beginning, and I should also add, for some of the viewers may not know, Ron Rivest, like Bruce, they're both cryptographers who have gotten interested in these questions. So there's a very, very interesting debate happening where mathematically sophisticated people are really beginning to think about this in much more systematic ways and understanding the strengths and weaknesses of these systems. So there also are a couple of questions from the audience, and Cheryl Graves wants to know, what role can you see trusted non-partisan organizations like the League of Women Voters having in helping voters to have confidence in the process and in the results?
I guess I can start with that. That The problem is deeper than that. We are so partisan in the country. We're getting our news from so many different sources that if someone like the League of Women Voters says something you don't agree with, you're more than likely to say, oh, the League of Women Voters is corrupted. So that notion in the 60s that there were these uncorruptible organizations that you can go for the truth, just doesn't exist today to the same degree. So, I like League of Women Voters in consumer goods, Consumer Reports. You think of these organizations that are traditionally trusted. They are trusted by some of us, but those we want to convince, we want to trust them, aren't trusting them, and I don't think we can get back to that world. I think we have to look more forward than back in thinking about those institutions.
So, Karen, you spoke a little bit at the beginning about how it is that it's very hard for you to get your communications out there amidst the noise. So that seems to me to be a kind of a similar question. So when you have people who are perhaps less trusting in the official voice that this is how it is done than before, how do you try to deal with that?
Well, one of the first things that we do is to make sure that we disseminate information across the board. Our sunshine list, as it's considered, is available to anyone to be receiving our press releases. North Carolina has a pretty open public records law, so we're compliant in that nature. But it's that we sit down at the table with all sides. We do work with the League of Women Voters, and they are a nonpartisan organization. But I think Bruce did touch on something that, even the subject of voting and how voting methods or how we register people to vote has become partisan. And so when even a nonpartisan organization aligns themselves, then that stirs a controversy right there. So we do try to make an effort to sit down at the table with all sides, make sure they're aware of the procedures or policies that we're putting into place, the guidelines. But it's a difficult situation when we've become a very partisan environment, and it's no longer it's no longer a concerted effort at times among organizations to just ensure that everyone has the right to vote. And so it's a very fine line that we have to walk. And then you also get into the situation where some of these very organizations we're talking about become the plaintiffs in our lawsuits. So then there's that challenge.
Okay, I can imagine that's a whole lot of headaches that you have to deal with. And another question is asking about the more immediate headaches, which is from Christine, who wants to know, how concerned are you with voter suppression and vote security in 2020? And while the long-term solutions proposed here are great, she also wants to know, what are the best solutions to be applied immediately in the next 3 to 4 weeks? What kinds of things can you do in the short term as well as in the long term?
That's probably one for me first, at least.
Definitely one for you.
So, I think it's what folks don't realize is how much planning and preparation go into an election. I actually have my project management certification because I submitted to the Institute that elections is a project. A single election is a project, and I see it through, and we work it that way. It's a logistics operation. We do so much in advance. It was things like this is the best example I can give. We knew that with the pandemic, we would have to have more social distancing. We would want to reduce lines to reduce exposure. And so North Carolina has always had a tremendous one-stop, or what we call one-stop, in-person early voting period. But we couldn't do it the same way this year. So I had to issue an emergency order that said that there would be one early voting center per 20,000 people. The counties could request a waiver if they could demonstrate that they had moved to a facility that was large enough to accommodate, a large group of people. But then also that on the first 2 weekends of that period, that they would be open a minimum of 10 hours. Now, that doesn't sound like, that may not be what you're thinking of, because that's not a long-term solution, but that was a solution that we had to put in place because we had looked at the data and seen that we had on more than one day in many counties when they had a fewer number of sites or a fewer number of hours, we were having lines of 1,500 or 2,000 people in a day. Now, we had that again yesterday because that was the start, and we broke a record of turnout for the first day and for a single day in our state. But we just had to put in things in place that could mitigate that situation in advance. I heard my colleague from Virginia, we were part of a panel, and Commissioner Piper said that they have a book of all the scenarios, and they sit, in advance of the elections and try to come up with every possible scenario. So that's the behind the scenes part that's going on with elections. These are long-term goals. Voluntary voting system guidelines didn't happen overnight, and certainly the new version isn't happening overnight. But we'll get there when we set those long-term goals. But what election administrators and what makes it a profession is that we do sit and plan. We'll finish up the election with a lessons learned of what worked, what didn't work, and what can we improve upon, and we'll implement those things. We did that back in March with our primary. We did that with our second primary, all to be ready for this election that we're having right now. That may not reassure Christine, but I hope that it kind of gives an insight to, we're looking at data, we're looking at experiences and processes, and are trying to fine tune it as best we can to ensure that we do not have a line issue, or that we do not have an issue with the voting equipment, and what are those backup procedures and contingency plans.
So, Bruce, I know that there has been some skepticism expressed by the National Academies of Science and others about electronic voting. Could you just give a quick 45-second encapsulation of this debate? I know that's a horrible request to make, but I'm making it.
No, it is. So pretty much everybody involved in computer security, election security, says that internet voting is a disaster. Don't do it. The basic problem is we can't secure the systems. I can't secure the phones or the computers or the software or anything. A retort I'll often hear is, how come I can bank online, maybe involving thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars, but I can't vote online? The reason is actually the anonymity requirement. The reason you can do commerce online is because your name is attached to everything. And if something goes wrong, we can figure out what happened and roll it back and undo the transaction. Because voting requires this hard separation between who can vote and what your vote is. You can't bring all the computer security techniques we have to the voting problem. So you will not see internet voting anytime soon, as long as voter anonymity is important.
Okay, and another question which I know Bruce has thought about, but which Karen may also have some thoughts about, a question which has come in asking about why the media and public discourse isn't paying enough attention to foreign hacking. Though we talk a lot about disinformation, but we don't talk nearly as much about hacking. So maybe if either of you would like to take that on.
I can start. I think there are two reasons. One, we're not seeing it yet. If there's going to be hacking on the election system, it's going to happen on election day. It'll be either systems going down, data being corrupted, votes being changed. So it hasn't happened yet. The second is the stuff that is done by US Cyber Command and NSA, that's classified. We know now that in 2018, US Cyber Command actually disrupted a Russian organization, like went into their network inside Russia and took down their computers in the days running up to election day, because somehow we knew what they were going to do and we wanted to stop it. So there are things happening in the classified world that we're not seeing because it doesn't make the news. And any big attack is going to happen when it's too late to do anything about it. So those are the two reasons you're not seeing them being talked about. You'll hear them talked about maybe afterwards.
Karen, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Well, and what I would add is that we have to be careful about talking about what we're doing. The reason it's classified is because if we show our game plan, then we open ourselves up to attack even more. When we say that hacking or an attack is occurring, I mean, that's sort of saying that we're in battle. And if that's the case, do we really want our opponent to know the sensors that we're using, or the ways that we're trying to mitigate. You don't win when you show your opponent your game plan. So we have to be careful about that and know that those procedures are in place.
So transparency in systems, but secrecy in tactics.
Perfect. Well, this has just been a fantastic conversation with the two of you. I want to thank you both for being with us here today. I think this is exactly what I had hoped this conversation was going to be. It's a wonderful mixture of the practicalities and the bigger questions, and seeing how the two of them talk to each other. So thank you so much. And also thank you to our audience for watching and for sending in such great questions. And please join the SNF Agora again next Friday for another session, which is going to be on young people in the 2020 election. And this discussion will explore youth attitudes towards the election and democracy writ large, and the role that young people will play in determining the outcome of the election and our future politics. And you can find information about next week's webcast, as well as a recording of today's webcast, on the SNF Agora website at snfagora.jhu.edu. And you can also now find SNF Agora Conversations on Apple Podcasts. So thank you all so much, and we hope to see you again next week. Thank you.
And go vote.
Thank you. That's right. Go vote.